Today I want to talk about map size in Fire Emblem fan games and what I prefer, what I think is the are important things to consider when designing your maps to be large or small or somewhere in between. And I have a picture of Sigurd because his game is known for having comically large maps, and I thought it would fit. So first of all, I want to talk about vanilla maps and their size. I'm going to ignore Fire Emblem 4 because it's clearly an outlier, but I want to talk about mostly Fire Emblem 6, with some Awakening and Fire Emblem 8 thrown in. So firstly, you can see that I have two Fire Emblem 6 maps here, which are Chapter 14X and Chapter 8, and these are probably two of the most hated maps in the game, and as you can see, they're both really large and they're very linear in how they play. So, for example, Chapter 8, you're basically just taking a really slow walk all around the entire map until you finally get to the Seas Point. And it doesn't help that, there's not really that many options. You just have to go in the straight line. You can go into the chest room and you can rescue Liliana, but overall, you're just walking in a really boring direction with not much variation. And then Chapter 14X, a lot of people just skip this map, but if you were to play it straight, of course, the gimmick of the map tiles going underwater is really annoying. But again, the structure is really similar. It's just a straight line to the Seas Point with a couple enemies in the way, and I can't really say it's particularly fun or engaging. Both these maps are, I'd say, probably really boring usually, and they play really slowly to the point where after I complete them, I want to put the game down instead of playing more, even if I have the time. So then I want to move on to an Awakening map. This is the map that you get Priam, and as you can see, it's a huge map with a lot of player units, a lot of enemies, but you start extremely far from the enemy, so the first few turns you're just walking, and there's not much going on here. It's just a really dull map in general until you reach the enemies. Then I wanted to take a look at this map. It's from the post game of Fire Emblem 8, and again, it's super linear, super tight. There's no terrain here, and it's just really huge, so you're taking a long time to go about this linear path. And I just wanted to mention that vanilla games often have this problem where the maps are overly large and overly tedious, and these become some of the most disliked maps in their respective games, or even across the series. Like I know Fire Emblem 6 maps, a lot of people dislike them most across the series because they can be really big and tedious. Not all of them, of course, and not everybody says this, but I know I've heard it before. So my position on this is that I enjoy smaller maps in general, and I wanted to talk about why I think that is. So the first big thing is just using the space you have wisely. I think more importantly than having a large map or even just having a small map is how you use the space you're given, and making use of the space efficiently to me is more important than having more space, period. And I think a lot of people would agree with this in general. And small maps provide a really good way and a really easy way to make an efficient use of space because you don't have that much, so you're forced to be creative with how you design the map flow and how you can control the player's pacing. Then the second thing is sort of related to this. If you don't use this space properly in larger maps, there can be a lot of dead turns or turns where you're not doing anything interesting besides walking from point A to point B and doing things like that. So in a small map, because there's just not that much space to walk around in, you're probably going to be engaging in combat or doing something interesting for most of the time, or prepping for the next turn or whatever, because just there's not enough space to be walking around freely to your next destination. And then again, game pacing is the third one, which is to say that if you have, usually small maps take less time to play than large maps, obviously because there's just less to do overall, like less moving, less enemies usually. So they take a shorter time to play, and this can really benefit the game's pacing because if a player has a fun time playing a map that takes them maybe 20 or 30 minutes instead of an hour, then they're more likely to keep on playing in that session. This isn't a necessity, but it can be nice to have for people, and it can help making the game enjoyable for long periods of time for them. So next I want to talk about varying map sizes, because obviously you don't need to just have small maps or just have big maps. And I think varying size is pretty important because it can change up the pace of your game. It doesn't have to always be the same thing. You can have something different and interesting, so the player's kind of maybe caught off guard, or they play a lot of small maps and they're finally led on to a big one, and it's kind of a big moment in the game. And then kind of tying into that, big maps can be really good for selling a climactic feel. Like this is chapter 21 from Fire Emblem 6, which again, the map's quality is not really the sort of point I want to make here. It's that this is a pretty important moment in the game, and the size of the map really sells that because you're traveling this huge distance. You know, there's a lot of enemies, so it really like lets you feel like this is an epic moment in the game. And then overall, if your map sizes are varied, or as they usually are in most Fire Emblem games, that they get bigger over time, it can help instill a sense of progression within the player, and they feel like things are getting more high stakes or they're getting more exciting over time. Yeah. And then a couple things I wanted to say are what to watch out for if you want to make big maps or larger maps. I'm not opposed to them. I think they can be a really cool tool when used appropriately, but I've noticed that a lot of new uh, people who are new to this sort of thing misuse big maps and kind of misunderstand it, because it's really easy to overestimate how big your map needs to be um, when you're starting out, right? So the first thing I wanted to mention is enemy quality and enemy density, and these things are sort of linked together, because if you have lower enemy density, then your enemies have to be stronger to make up for it. Otherwise, you'll be facing one enemy maybe every turn, and they'll go down really easily, and then you just walk up to the next enemy, something like that. But if you have stronger enemies and you face less per turn, then you still have more to do because they'll be harder to kill. You have to plan around them more, and they can make the map feel more, I guess, eventful than maybe it actually might be, considering the amount of enemies. And then for enemy density, it's just the same thing. I'm going back to dead turns. If you have a lot of enemies in the map, it doesn't need to be like overrun with enemies, but if there are a good amount of enemies for the map size, then the player will constantly be facing some sort of resistance or challenge, and it'll keep them sort of having fun instead of just moving on to my third point, walking around from point A to point B. Because I know in a lot of games, when you've cleared out the map, maybe, then you can spend a long time trekking from just maybe the midpoint of the map to the cease point or the kill boss point or whatever it is, and you want to avoid that. So if you want to make a big map, make sure you get it tested, and you play around with how the pacing of the map itself goes, so that you're not spending so much time with this. And then the fourth thing to watch out for kind of relates back to Fire Emblem 4 with Sigurd in the title slide, which is that if you have a big map and your enemy quality is maybe too low and your mounts are strong, like Marcus here from Fire Emblem 7, then mounted units can easily overwhelm your game. And I know a lot of creators are really keen on having mounts not be as overpowered as they might be in vanilla games. So if your maps are so large that you just need to have mounts in order to make it like not intolerable to play, then that's something you might want to watch out for. Of course, mounts can be dominant on small maps too, but even more so on large maps, because if you're spending a long time moving units around, you want to spend as little time as possible. So even if I wanted to use a 5-move unit, it's just not worth it because it's so tedious moving them, and they get to the destination like maybe 4 turns slower than my mounted unit, so I'm just not going to use them. Of course, this relates into, again, enemy quality and density and the quality of your player mount units, but it's something that I think people would like to consider, and it's a balancing problem that a lot of people are invested in, and it's a good consideration. So that's it. I don't really have that much to say on this, other than I think small maps can be a good tool, new for new people especially. Like if you know what you're doing, then of course going on to bigger maps is perfectly fine because you've already learned a lot of these lessons. But particularly for new people, bigger maps can just be there because you're not sure how big a map should be or how a map flow um, should be again, and you can easily overestimate the size, which ends up in a pretty boring map. So I think these kinds of considerations can be important. You don't need to have small maps, but if you have a big map where the enemies are extremely spread out and maybe a bit weaker than your player units, then you might want to add in a couple more enemies or just shrink the map so you can have the same amount of enemies and not, I guess, mess around with the EXP curve or whatever. And yeah, that's all I have to say.